this week and next week, we're just doing a little mini 2-week series called Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. And this morning, we're going to look at an Old Testament story in a message that I've entitled, Passing the Tests of Life. Passing the Test of Life. It's a simple story, but yet so profound, and I feel like we can just draw a couple lessons from this story that will help us in our everyday life. Let me just start by asking, what comes to your mind when you hear the word test? What do you think about? What is your mind? What are the memories that come to your head? Are you thinking about a specific test that you maybe took at one point or another in your life? Maybe you aced a test, or maybe you failed a test badly. Maybe you're remembering that. Maybe you're remembering when you got your driver's license and took a driver's test when you were maybe around 16 or so. In Iowa, where I'm from, the corn state, the farm state, we drive when we're 14. And that is dangerous now that I'm an adult looking back, but I was cruising around town as a 14-year-old in Iowa. And that's just, even just saying it out loud right now, I'm like, wow, I can't believe anybody was allowed to do that. And my parents are here actually this morning, all the way from Akron. And I know some of those days when I was driving as a 14-year-old, they wish they had one of those brakes that the driver's ed class had. Yeah, he's nodding his head. I made a few dings along the way, but my Camry lasted quite a while. But so maybe you're thinking of that. Maybe you are thinking of your ACT or your SAT exams that you took in preparing for college. Maybe if you're a lawyer, you remember studying for the LSATs, or if you're a public accountant, you may remember, or we have actually someone currently in our church studying for those 3 grueling CPA exams. So maybe you're thinking of that. Maybe we actually have a couple NFL players in our church. Maybe you begin to think about the Wonderlic test that they ask you to take before you go into the National Football League. No matter what you think about, no matter what comes to your mind when I say the word test, or when you think about test, one of 2 things are going to happen. One, you're going to have a positive reaction, maybe, if you're a smart student or you tend to do well in taking tests. For the rest of us, we may have more of a negative reaction to the word test. Maybe we just did not do well taking tests. In fact, 30% of American students suffer from test anxiety. It's real. Some people call it testophobia. It's actually out there. 30% say and the symptoms can be anything from a headache to stomach ache to even vomiting or excessive sweating. It can lead to panic attacks and depression and anger. I mean, this is serious. Some people really dislike taking tests, and they don't do well. The tests that you probably thought, and the tests, most of them that I mentioned, really were geared more toward a classroom setting, taking a test, an oral or written exam with a paper and a pencil. Today, I want to look at a different type of test. It is a test that we face even as adults in everyday life. They are tests that God actually allows us to face. So today I want to look at passing the test of life. The tests that we face now are more of difficult situations or trials that we may go through. So if we can just kind of remove the thought of a test being oral, written with a pen or paper, and not think about even what we'll think of as test is like testing the proficiency in a classroom, but these tests are really testing our character in life. And these tests aren't given, we have to remember, these tests aren't given by humans, by professors, by proctors. These tests are given to us by God. And they are trials or difficult situations that we go through in life. And all of us are going to experience tests or difficult situations or seasons of life that are just challenging. We'll all face them one time or another. If we haven't already, we will. A lot of us are going through probably something right now. And I don't know what that is, but before we go any further, let me even just clarify even more of what a test is not. A test is not being tempted. In the book of James, we can find the difference between test and tempt. My dad, who's been a pastor all of my life, still is a pastor, puts it in a very simple way that I'll share with you today. God tests us to make us strong. He'll give us tests to help us be strong. The devil tempts us to make us do wrong. Okay, so there's a distinct difference there. When we're talking about tests today, we're not talking about being tempted into doing something wrong. God makes us tests us to make us strong. The devil tempts us to make us do wrong. So we have to recognize the difference there before we can really grasp what a test is. God will test us to bring the best out of us. He wants to test our character, our obedience. He wants to test our faithfulness to him. This isn't his way of trying to slip us up or even make our lives miserable. He just simply wants us to come out on the other end stronger, with more faith than we did going into the test. God's been testing people since the beginning of time, and he has tested many, many people throughout the Bible, but today I want to look at one specific story in the book of Daniel, which is in the Old Testament, of 3 young men who passed a test with flying colors. And due to the sake of the length of the story, I'm not going to read it word for word, but I'm just going to summarize the story, and then we're going to look, and I think we can find a couple lessons to pull out that can really help us when we go through tests of our own in our own life. This story is about 3 young men who were leaders in the Babylonian Empire. Their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, when I was preparing, I thought about taking tests. I thought about maybe doing a little spelling test this morning and see how many of you would be able to spell these names. I actually made it a challenge this week. Some of you may have seen it on Twitter or Facebook, that I actually, by the end of the week, I wanted to be able to spell these without using my Bible. And I was able to, although I don't know if I could do it now, but I was able to do it. And these 3 young men were leaders in the empire, ruled by a man named King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar, not a nice man by any means, and he one day decided he was going to make a 90 feet tall golden statue. And then he was going to called all the leaders from around the empire. Some of these were princes and governors. There were civil leaders. There were legal leaders. There were some military leaders that he called in. There were hundreds. Scholars believe there were hundreds of leaders that came to where King Nebuchadnezzar was in the capital city of Babylon. And he said to everyone that was there, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, everybody here needs to bow down to this statue and worship it. Otherwise, you're going to be thrown into a massive furnace that some people believe could have been as hot as 1,800 degrees. So this was an incredibly lethal furnace, to say the least. And so he said, when the orchestra plays, you'll read it in your Bible, when the music sounds, everyone is going to bow down and worship this statue. And so when the trumpet sounded and the harps played, everybody bowed down except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. 3 men did not bow down. They refused to bow down. Well, this didn't take long for several people. Actually, the Bible refers to them as astrologers. That must have been their occupation. They noticed it. They were upset. So they went right to the king and said, hey, King Nebuchadnezzar, I know you just said everyone has to bow down, otherwise they're going to die. These 3 men are not worshiping the statue. So he was furious. The king was furious. He summoned the 3 men. They came to him, and he said to them, listen, fellas, I appointed you as leaders in this empire. When you read it, it almost sounds like he almost didn't want them to get the punishment of dying in the furnace, of being thrown in the furnace. So he gave them a second chance. He said, hey, listen, I told you this is what you need to do. Now, I'm going to give you one more chance. You need to bow down and worship this statue. I'm telling you, you have to, otherwise you will die. And these 3 men still refused to do it. And so instantly, he actually told the soldiers, I want you to make the furnace even hotter. It says make it 7 times as hot, which in the Bible is an idiom, which when they use that term 7 times as hotter, it basically just means make it as hot as possible. Then he got the 3 strongest guards and said, I want you to tie these men up and throw them in the furnace immediately. And so that's what happened. These soldiers took them, they threw them in the furnace. Here's how hot it really was. The 3 soldiers died just from being exposed to the fire. They weren't even, they didn't even touch it. They were outside, they threw them in, and they died. It was so hot. So King Nebuchadnezzar kind of, wiped his hands and said, finally, the guys that are kind of giving me pushback and questioning my authority, they're gone. The Bible doesn't really explain how long he waited, but eventually King Nebuchadnezzar went and he looked into the furnace. And he noticed that a couple things. One, there was 4 people walking around. They only threw in 3, and now there's a 4th. And the other weird thing is what I just said. They were walking around. They were not dead. These 4 people were still alive. Well, what they came to realize was the 4th man was an angel sent from God to protect Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the king couldn't believe it, amazed, called the men to come out, and instantly declared their God, who is the God that we serve today, as the God of the Babylonian Empire. And he actually told everyone that they have to worship these 3 men, their God. The Bible says that their clothes weren't even burned, their hair wasn't singed. You couldn't even tell that they were in the furnace. And then King Nebuchadnezzar, even after honoring God, honored these men by giving them a promotion in the empire at their levels of leadership. So we have this story of these three boys, these 3 young men, who were faced with a test that probably many of us would never even face anything similar. And when I say similar, I mean face something that's like life or death. But they somehow passed this test with flying colors. And we're going to go through tests, although not the same. So I want to look at just a couple things that we can learn from them that will help us when we go through tests of our own. So the first thing, if you're taking notes, that we can learn from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in this story found in Daniel is we need to stay faithful. We need to stay faithful. If you look in verse 7, we'll pull it up on the screen if you have your Bible, Daniel chapter 3, verse 7. It says, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But then go to verse 12. And this is the 3 astrologers that basically ratted the 3 men out. They went to them and they said to the king, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. When everybody else bowed down, and I don't know what, the Bible doesn't say what their faith necessarily was, but everybody, whether they believed in God or they didn't and they believed in the statue or worshiped the statue, everybody bowed down except for the 3 men. Now, before we can really be too harsh on them and say, well, if I was them, I'm a Christ follower. I would never worship an idol. I would give my life. I know who I serve, and that's God. Well, before we, do that a little bit too much, let's even just kind of step back in that story, look at a couple details, and put ourselves in their shoes. First of all, pretend you and a couple friends have been called by a ruler of a nation, and it's all the prominent leaders in the country, and they call you in, and you're there, and they tell everybody to do something, and if you don't, you're going to die. And there's only 3 of you, so you're definitely the minority, okay? So their strike 1 is like you're 3 out of several hundred that's not doing it. Second of all, you know what the punishment is all about. It's been made very clear. They've said it several times. If you don't do this, you will die. Not only do they know the punishment, they know now that the furnace has been cranked up to its max heat, and they can actually see the furnace over on the hillside. They've got the furnaces back then looked like a milk bottle, so the old-fashioned milk bottle, so it started a little wider and then with the narrow neck, and there was an opening at the top and an opening at the bottom. So they could see the flames, they could see the smoke, they may even be able to smell some of the, how you can just smell a bonfire, the smoke, you can tell. So they were visualizing their punishment, they could hear what the punishment was going to be. They knew, this one gets me, they knew King Nebuchadnezzar wasn't bluffing. I might have thought, hey, maybe something will happen, but is he really going to throw 3 men and burn them alive just if they don't do this? Well, he wasn't bluffing, because in Jeremiah 29:22, it says that you can read this story, and that took place before this story. King Nebuchadnezzar had thrown a couple people in a fiery furnace already. So they knew he was going to follow through with it. And then on top of all that, they've been given a second chance. It's one thing to kind of stand firm and, hey, I'm not going to worship this. And then when you kind of, you maybe call his bluff, and then they bring you up and they're like, listen, I'm going to give you one more chance, and then it's going to happen. You're going to die. And then so you've had time to think about it, and you still make that conscious decision. I mean, these guys were ultimately faithful to their God. And when we face tests in our life, we have got to have the same kind of faithfulness that these men did to their God. I don't know what you're facing right now, what test you're going through right now. Maybe it's something, maybe you've lost your job, and God's just testing you and testing you to see if you'll be faithful and still serve God and still thank him for the other blessings that you have and trust that he will provide. Maybe you're going through a difficulty in your marriage, and God's just testing you to see how you'll respond in that difficult situation with your spouse. Will you stay faithful to them, and will you stay faithful to God, even when things seem a little bleak in a marriage? Maybe finances are tough, and God's testing you. Will you be faithful to continue to give to me? Will you be faithful to continue to live for me even when things are going tough? Maybe with your children, you're having a challenge with a relationship with one of your children, and it's just really testing your patience. And God just wants to test you. Will you be faithful even when everyone else who maybe would go through that same situation might cave in, might take the easy road out? Will you be faithful? God wants us to be faithful even when it's tough. Probably none of us were around in 1924. Okay, I'm taking the, no one said I was. I don't remember anything about this, but I looked up a story and I learned about it this week. There was a Scottish sprinter by the name of Eric Liddell. Some of you may remember the story about him. He was at the time, and it's hard to believe, but he was like the Usain Bolt of 1920s. He was favored so overwhelmingly by the media and by the track experts and the Olympic experts that he was going to win the 100-meter dash at the 1924 Olympics in Paris. And he'd been training undoubtedly all of his life, especially very intensely over the last 4 years. And he was ready to win the gold. I mean, he had it all going for him. He was healthy. He was ready to go. Several months before the Olympics, he received a letter that was the schedule of the Olympics, the schedule of the track meet. And he realized that the preliminary heat of the 100-meter dash was going to be run on a Sunday. Now, Eric was a Christ follower, and he had a strong conviction that he would not run any track meets or any races on Sundays. That was his Sabbath that he was going to honor. And so he couldn't run the 100-meter dash. He did not want to. I guess he could have. He chose not to. So he withdrew from the 100-meter dash. Imagine if Usain Bolt just withdrew from the Olympics. I mean, this guy just withdrew. He said, I will not do it. Now, of course, the media just made a heyday about it, talked about how he's putting, talking about his faith in Jesus and how he's honoring the Sabbath and he's not running. And so what he did, though, was instead of just not running at all, he decided he would train for the 400-meter dash. He had several months to get ready, and he had about part of that time he had a chance to be able to qualify. And he did, barely. He qualified. He ran the 400, qualified for the Olympics. The records show that he ran a very subpar, barely got in, because that wasn't his race. A 400 was totally different than the 100, but he got in. And he made it to the finals, believe it or not. And on the day of the final, just moments before the race actually, it's recorded that the masseuse for the U.S. Olympic team came over to him and slipped him a piece of paper and walked away. And Eric opened up that little piece of paper, and on it were the words of God from 1 Samuel 2:30. And it says, I will honor those who honor me. Isn't that cool? I will honor those who honor me. So Eric felt encouraged. He took that paper, he held it in his hand actually the entire race. The gun went off and he began to run, and he was neck and neck with some of the other elite sprinters. And by the time they got that last turn, he just said he gave it everything he had. And he crossed the finish line first. Not only did he win the Olympic gold medal in the 400-meter dash, but he broke the existing Olympic and world record at the time. And so it's just an incredible story that because Eric was willing to honor God with his faithfulness, God honored Eric. And just like in the story, the three men who were willing to be faithful to God and to honor God and put God above what seemed like a horrible decision to not just go along with the crowd at the time because they knew what the penalty was. Just like Eric did that, God honored those men, and it says at the end of the story that God honored Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and even promoted them to a higher position in the empire. God will honor us if we honor him with our faithfulness. Now, not only do we need to be faithful when we face tests, but we need to always trust. We need to stay faithful, and we need to always trust. Look at verse 17 here in Daniel chapter 3. It says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, this is the three men speaking, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. Notice the confidence they had, just saying that even if you throw us in the furnace, we believe that God can save us. I mean, that is incredible confidence to know that they serve a God who could save them. And they were even willing to say, you can throw me in because I'm confident that God has the ability to save us. But here's what I really want us to notice. This is huge. These are some of the most powerful words that I believe we can find in the Bible. Verse 18 says, but even if he doesn't. Those 5 words. Just think about those words. But even if he doesn't. Okay? We want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. But even if he doesn't. It's one thing to be confident on that front end in verse 17 and say, Lord, I know that you can bring me through this test. I know that no matter what, I believe in you, you will save me. But it's another thing to say, Lord, I trust you even if you don't. But even if he doesn't. Those are huge words that we have to understand because, you see, God has the ability, God has the power to bring us through anything that we go through in life. No matter what your test is, God is almighty, he's all powerful, he can bring us through. But sometimes he doesn't. And we don't always know why he doesn't, but he just doesn't sometimes. And I know we can get a little bit of insight in Romans 5:3-4 that says we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us to develop endurance. And endurance develops character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation. So just like we said in the beginning, going through tests, God tests us to make us strong. He tests us to build our character. And the same is true, it says right here in Romans, that we can rejoice when we run into problems and trials because it develops our character. But even if he doesn't bring me through the situation that I'm facing in life, still, I will trust in God. There's a story in the Old Testament about a man named Job. You can read about him. He has a book named after him called Job. It's right before Psalms and Proverbs. Job was tested by God he was tested more than any Bible character ever. I mean, if you go through and read, God took away his family, took away his friends, took away his money. He put him through some nasty sicknesses and diseases. I mean, he totally wiped Job's life out. And I don't want to get into the details of that story. That's for another time. But what I do want you to know are the words that we can find in Job 13:15. If we could have Job's attitude when we face these difficult situations in our life, when we face tests, if we had this kind of attitude, Job 13:15, because even if he killed me, I'd keep on hoping. Even if he killed me, I'd keep on hoping. But even if he doesn't bring me through, I still trust in God. It's a totally different ballgame when we understand that God may not always bring us through the way we think he should, okay? He doesn't promise that we won't go through trials or difficult situations, but he does promise that he'll always be with us. And we can rest assured on that promise, that if we stay faithful and trust with God's help, we will pass the test. God does not guarantee that we won't go through anything. He doesn't guarantee that, but he does guarantee that he'll be with us during the difficult situations. And even though the outcome may be different than what we want, God has a plan that we can't necessarily see, but he has a plan. And so if we trust in him, even when it's difficult, even if we know that maybe the outcome isn't what we were wanting, and we trust in God, he can bring us through. Romans 8:28 says that all things work together for good for those who love the Lord. Luke 1:37, nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is impossible with God. I'm going to invite Christy to come at this time. Passing tests in life, it's a unique thing, because unlike tests like we take in school, like we talked about earlier, unlike those kind of tests, sometimes the outcome doesn't matter as much as actually taking the test. The outcome of a test in life cannot end up the way we want it to, but we still passed the test. If we are faithful to God, and if we trust in God no matter what, even if the outcome is different than what we thought, we still pass the test. Even if God wouldn't have spared Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's life, and they would have died in that furnace, he still would have said, good job, guys. You passed the test. You were faithful to me. You didn't bow down because everyone else did. You stood strong for me. And then you trusted me that even if I don't spare your life, you're okay with that. Now again, we're not necessarily going through situations where we have to worry about dying, but can we get to the place where we can just say to God, Lord, I'm faithful. I want to be faithful to you, and I trust that no matter what happens, no matter the circumstance, even if it doesn't come out the way I think it should, I'm going to trust you and know that you've got a plan and you've got a purpose. A couple years ago, I heard an incredible story that I just want to share with you guys today. It's a story about a man named Pablo, who was from Wamba, Kenya. Pablo from Kenya. God called him to plant a church in the small town of Nagali. So every Saturday, Pablo would walk 8 hours to the town of Nagali. He would pitch a tent, then he would spend the night. Sunday morning, he would get up and he would draw a square in the dirt. And that was the border of the sanctuary. He then would set up stones on these old wooden benches to serve as the congregation or the people in the church. He then would preach to these stones because there was no one else around. For the first few weeks, a couple kids came, but their parents eventually didn't want them to be there, and so they no longer came. And so week after week, Pablo preached to these stones, these rocks. He would pack up when he was done, and he would walk back 8 hours Sunday evening to his home. Then he would work his job Monday through Friday, the whole week, and then he would return the following Saturday. The people of Nagali really didn't like what he was doing, and so every time he left, they would knock over the benches, and they would scatter the stones, and they would mess up his lines that he had made. And every single week for an entire year, Pablo would walk 8 hours on a Saturday, and then he would preach to stones, never once preaching to a human being. 52 weeks Pablo did this, preached to the stones in Nagali. I have to confess that if that was me, probably after a few weeks I may have considered it done. I probably would have concluded that maybe that wasn't God's will for my life, and I would have moved on to something else, but not Pablo, and I'm glad he didn't. Because at the beginning of the second year, after 52 weeks, 8 hours one way, 8 hours back, never seeing a human being, preaching to rocks, a new sermon every week, 52 times. Finally, at the beginning, one Sunday, a man came out from behind the bushes. He had been listening to Pastor Pablo preach the past several weeks and wanted to know who Jesus was. He asked Pablo if he would come and pray for his son who had never walked before. This was the first positive experience Pablo had had in over a year. He went to the house of the man, and before he prayed for the son, he told this whole family about Jesus, and all of them became Christ followers that day. Then Pablo prayed for the boy, and he was healed. Not long after, the entire village gave their hearts to Jesus Christ. If you go to Nagali today, there's a thriving church. People lifting their hands, worshiping Jesus Christ, worshiping the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. They went on to actually plant more churches in that region. Could you imagine the end of the story if Pablo wouldn't have passed the test? Can you imagine the amount of faithfulness it took for a man to walk 16 hours every weekend to preach to rocks? Just imagine that. The faithfulness to say to God, Lord, I know you're testing me to plant this church. I don't know why, because it's not working out. But Lord, even if no one ever comes, I trust that you have called me here for a reason. I believe that Pablo would have preached to the stones for the rest of his life. If you can do it 52 weeks, I don't think anything was going to stop him. Pablo faced an incredible test. But all he had to do was be faithful to God and to trust that God had a plan, that God had a purpose. Philippians 1:6, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Pablo preached to stones 52 weeks in a row, and because of that, there have been hundreds of people who have been saved, who have given their hearts to Jesus Christ, but it's because he passed the test. So when we're facing tests in our lives, let's remember Pablo. Let's remember that even though we can't see the outcome, we can't see the plan, God sees so much farther down the road than we can see. He knows why he's bringing us through these tests. It's not to trip us up. That's what tempting is. Testing is to make us strong. Tempting is to build our character. Testing helps us draw closer to Jesus Christ. God will allow us to face tests because he loves us. He loves you so much that he's willing to allow you to go through some difficult situations now and again so that you'll come out stronger and better on the other side. And the stories that take place when we pass the test, again, it's not the outcome. Let's forget about the outcome. It's the journey, it's the process. Stay faithful and always trust God.